Clara could feel the weight of silence pressing on her, a silence that had stretched far too long. The ship's emergency lights pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, casting eerie shadows against the cracked bulkheads. Somewhere in the darkness, a flickering console fought to stay alive, emitting a feeble hum. The atmosphere was growing thin, each breath a struggle. She curled her trembling fingers around the fragile body of her son, Karin, his form barely stirring in her arms. His once vibrant blue skin had faded to an unhealthy pallor, his breathing shallow. She had sent the distress signal hours ago, perhaps longer. Time had lost its meaning in this cold, dying vessel. The hope that anyone would answer it was dwindling. Xilarians did not venture into human-patrolled space, not since the uneasy truce between their species. They were alone, marooned in an asteroid field where even the stars seemed indifferent. Clara fought to stay conscious, her mind a storm of regret. She should never have taken this route. The shortcut through the asteroid belt had seemed safe, a calculated risk on what should have been an uneventful journey. But calculations had failed her. A rogue debris field had torn through their ship, crippling its engines, breaching the hull. The auxiliary oxygen was running out. Karin let out a weak sound, more exhale than word. She pressed her forehead against his, a silent promise that she would not let this be the end. A mother's will was stronger than fate itself, but will alone could not conjure breathable air. Then, against all logic, against all expectation, the ship's console flickered with new life. A response, a signal. The humans had heard them. The UHS Horizon cut through the void, its sleek frame gliding past tumbling asteroids with practiced precision. Captain Daniel Reese stood at the helm, his jaw set in determination as his crew worked around him. They had debated the decision. He had overruled them. A distress call was a distress call, human or not. Visual on the wreckage, Lieutenant Marco Vance announced, his hands flying over the controls. She's in bad shape. Radiation levels are rising, hull integrity near collapse. We won't have long. Reese nodded. Get us as close as you can without pulling us into that debris field. Prep an EVA team. Dr. Emily Carter was already fastening her medical kit to her suit, her mind racing through the implications. A Xilarian survivor, perhaps more than one. The tension between their species still simmered, but this wasn't a battlefield. This was a life-or-death rescue, and she had sworn an oath that did not recognize borders. The airlock cycled open, and the team pushed into the drifting wreckage. The gravity was failing, making their steps uncertain. Inside, the ship was a graveyard of dimming consoles and frozen silence. Then movement, a faint, flickering pulse on the life scanner. Reese took the lead, his flashlight sweeping over the wreckage until it landed on a figure slumped against the wall. A woman, her body curled protectively around a smaller form. Got them, he breathed. Emily was at his side in an instant, kneeling to check for vitals. The mother was alive but barely responsive. The child, he was worse. Too still, too quiet. A sense of urgency surged through her veins. We need to move now, she said, already pulling a compact oxygen mask from her kit. She placed it over the boy's face, watching his tiny chest for any sign of improvement. His oxygen saturation is critical. Reese lifted Clara into his arms as gently as the shifting gravity allowed. She stirred the contact, her golden eyes fluttering open. Disoriented, panicked. Easy, he said, his voice steady. We've got you. For a fleeting second, distrust flashed across her face. Then her gaze landed on Karin, on the humans tending to him, and her resistance crumbled. She let her head rest against Reese's shoulder, her body too weak to protest. The ship shuddered, a warning groan reverberating to the failing structure. Time's up, Vance called. We stay any longer, we'll be joining them in the afterlife. They moved fast, navigating the crumbling wreckage with practiced efficiency. The moment they crossed back into the horizon, the airlock sealed behind them, and the thud of repressurization signaled safety. Emily didn't waste a second. She tore off her helmet, rushing to stabilize Karin. The boy remained motionless, his tiny chest barely rising. She adjusted the oxygen flow, ran a scanner over his vitals. His body wasn't responding. A knot tightened in her stomach. Come on, little one, she murmured. Fight! Reese laid Clara on a medical stretcher, watching as her golden eyes fluttered open again. This time, they were filled with something raw. Fear, hope, desperation. Her lips parted, voice barely above a whisper. Karin? Emily met her gaze. She didn't know if she had an answer yet. Karin's breathing was barely perceptible, his small chest rising in uneven, fragile intervals. Dr. Emily Carter worked with controlled urgency, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had faced life-and-death situations before. But this was different. This was a Xilarating child, and no amount of human medical expertise could guarantee the right approach. Her scanner's readings were erratic, fluctuating between incomprehensible and alarming. Oxygen levels dangerously low, pulse irregular. The human-designed oxygen mask was only a temporary fix. If his lungs couldn't properly process it, she was simply delaying the inevitable. Clara struggled against her own weakness, propping herself up on the stretcher with trembling arms. He must live, she rasped, her voice thick with exhaustion and desperation. Her golden eyes, dull from dehydration, locked onto Emily's with a plea that needed no translation. Emily hesitated, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. We're trying, she said, softer than she meant to. But I need to understand his physiology. Your people, your biology, it's different from ours. We need help. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, as if summoning the last reserves of her strength. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. Our blood carries iron and cobalt. Your oxygen mix, too much nitrogen. She coughed, the sound rattling in her chest, but forced herself to continue. We require higher density, more concentrated. Emily nodded sharply. We can adjust for that. She turned to the ship's medtech interface, fingers flying across the controls, recalibrating the oxygen mixture to something closer to what Clara described. A human patient wouldn't survive such an adjustment, but Karin wasn't human. If Clara was right, it could save him. If she was wrong, the seconds stretched unbearably long as the newly mixed air flowed through the mask. At first, nothing. Karin remained still, and for a horrible moment. Emily feared they had been too late. Then, a tiny hitch in his breath, a shudder. His fingers curled slightly against the fabric of the medical bed. And then the sound, a faint, keening whimper, the smallest sign of life, but life nonetheless. Clara exhaled, her body sagging as if sheer willpower had been holding her upright. Relief shimmered in her tired eyes, but was edged with lingering fear. She reached for her son's tiny hand, brushing his fingers with her own, her touch barely more than a whisper. Captain Reese, who had been standing just outside the med bay, finally stepped forward. His usual composure had been unshaken through the rescue, but now he studied the scene with an expression that was unreadable. He's stable. Emily kept her eyes on the monitor, watching the readings slowly improve. For now, his body is responding to the oxygen adjustment, but I need to run more tests. His system is fragile, and I still don't know how extensive the damage is. Clara looked up, forcing herself to meet Reese's gaze. There was something guarded in her expression, a remnant of the wariness her people had been taught to toward humans. But beneath it, there was gratitude. You saved us, she said, voice hoarse but resolute. You did not have to. Reese's expression softened slightly. That's where you're wrong. He crossed his arms, glancing between her and Emily. We don't leave people to die, no matter what side of the stars they come from. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Clara's face. Perhaps she had not expected such a simple, absolute answer. Perhaps she had never believed humans capable of such a thing. The moment of fragile peace was short-lived. A sharp warning tone blared through the med bay, followed by Lieutenant Vance's voice crackling over the ship's comms. Captain, we got a problem. We took some damage getting through that asteroid belt, and it's worse than we thought. The primary power core is destabilizing. We're looking at potential system failures within the next 2 hours. Reese swore under his breath. How bad? Bad enough. If we can't reroute power, we'll lose life support and propulsion. And if that happens, we're drifting straight into the next wave of debris. Emily clenched her jaw. The last thing they needed was another crisis. She turned to Clara, who had gone rigid at the news. Your ship. Do you have anything we can use? Backup power cells? Energy regulators? Clara closed her eyes, searching her memories for something useful. The Xilarating vessel had been designed for deep space travel, with redundancies that might still be intact. But venturing back into the wreckage would be dangerous. There is an energy converter. If it survived the impact, it could stabilize your core. She hesitated, glancing at Corinne, who still lay motionless but breathing. I will go with you. Rhys frowned. You're in no condition to... I must, she interrupted, steel creeping back into her voice. Your crew does not know Xilarating technology. I do. Emily looked between them, torn. Clara was right. They needed her knowledge, but the strain could push her body past recovery. Rhys ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. All right, but you follow my lead, and if I tell you to fall back, you do it. No arguments. Clara nodded, though something in her eyes said she would not obey that order if it meant saving her child. The ship trembled, a deep, guttural groan reverberating through the hull. Time was running out. The ship trembled as another violent shudder rippled through the hull, the groan of metal under strain reverberating through every corridor. Captain Rhys moved swiftly, leading the way through the dimly lit passage, his footsteps steady despite the chaos brewing around them. Clara kept pace beside him, her body weakened but her resolve unwavering. Every breath she took was laced with pain, but she forced herself forward. Her son still lived, but survival was not guaranteed, not unless they secured the power core. Lieutenant Vance's voice crackled through the comms. Captain, whatever you're doing, do it fast. We've lost stabilization in the secondary thrusters. I don't need to tell you what happens if we drift any further into this field. Rhys didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He knew the stakes. Every second they wasted brought them closer to disaster. The airlock to the Xilarating wreckage was barely holding together. Its frame twisted from the impact. Rhys hesitated only a moment before gripping the manual override. With a hiss, the door slid open, revealing the fractured remains of the alien ship. The damage was worse than it had seemed from the outside. Sections of floor had crumpled inward, exposing tangled wires and shattered consoles. The emergency lights pulsed weakly, barely illuminating the devastation. The air inside was thin, but still present, though the scent of burnt metal and failing circuitry was suffocating. Clara moved with purpose, her steps careful but sure. The energy converter is in the lower engineering bay, she said, her voice hoarse but focused. It should still be operational if the core breach didn't reach it. Rhys kept close behind her, scanning for structural weaknesses. The ship was on borrowed time. One wrong move and the entire wreck could collapse around them. They reached the engineering bay, and Clara immediately set to work, her fingers moving over the alien console with practiced ease. Rhys watched as she accessed what little remained of the ship's power reserves, searching for converter. A few tense moments passed. Then she exhaled sharply. Relief. It's here, she said. Intact. Rhys didn't waste time. He stepped forward, gripping the device and carefully detaching it from its failing connectors. The moment it disconnected, the entire ship let out a warning groan, as if it had been holding itself together by sheer force of will. A low vibration thrummed beneath their feet. Clara's gaze snapped to his. We have to go. Now. They turned, moving quickly back through the broken corridors. Behind them, something buckled, a deep, guttural crack that sent tremors through the floor. A section of the ceiling caved in just meters behind them, sparks showering the ground. Rhys pushed forward, reaching the airlock first. He turned just in time to see Clara stumble, her body weakened from exertion. Without hesitation, he grabbed her arm, pulling her forward as another tremor rocked the wreck. They crossed the threshold just as the Xilarating ship gave its final protest, a muffled implosion shaking the hull. The airlock sealed behind them, cutting off the chaos, leaving only the sound of their labored breathing. Rhys tapped his comm. Vance, we have a converter. Get engineering prepped. Copy that, but you better move. We got minutes before we're caught in the next debris wave. They didn't waste time. Clara was faltering, exhaustion threatening to take her under, but she kept moving. She had no choice. Karin was waiting. By the time they reached the engine room, Vance was already waiting, tools in hand. His usual sarcasm was absent, replaced by sharp efficiency. "Tell me this thing works." Clara moved past him, hands steady despite the tremors in her body. "It will," she said, "but I need access to your power relays." Vance stepped aside, letting her work. The tension in the room was palpable as she integrated the alien technology into the failing human system. Reese watched as warning lights flickered, fluctuating between red and yellow, teetering on the edge of failure. Clara's fingers hesitated for only a moment before she took a slow breath and initiated the final sequence. The ship shuddered, then steadied. The flickering lights stabilized. The engine's hum, which had been faltering, smoothed into a consistent rhythm. Vance let out a breath of disbelief. "We're back online." Reese didn't waste time celebrating. "Get us out of here." The bridge responded immediately. The ship's thrusters reignited, propulsion systems firing just as the next wave of debris closed in. The horizon pulled free, escaping the asteroid field with only seconds to spare. The tension that had coiled tight in Reese's chest finally loosened. But there was one more thing left unfinished. He turned to Clara. "Your son needs you." She didn't need to be told twice. In the med bay, Karin was still, but the monitor showed steady improvement. Emily had been monitoring him closely, adjusting his oxygen levels, tracking his progress. She looked up as Clara entered, offering a small nod. "He's stabilizing," she said. "He's strong." Clara moved to her son's side, pressing her forehead against his in a traditional Xilarating gesture of comfort. "My heart beats with yours," she whispered. And, for the first time since the disaster began, Karin stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto hers. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she let them fall. She had nearly lost them. She had nearly lost herself. But here, among those she had once considered strangers, they had been saved. Reese watched in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Emily stepped beside him, her voice quiet. "I think we changed something today." He exhaled, glancing toward Clara and her son. "Yeah," he said, "I think we did." As the horizon continued its journey, carrying its unlikely passengers toward a future neither had anticipated, the vast emptiness of space seemed just a little less cold.